Did anyone else fly to Prague? Anybody? Awesome. So I flew to Prague on Friday evening, and you know what I noticed taking off from the airport? The runway was not littered with the charred remains of previous flights. It's pretty remarkable. Flying is enormously complex. The aviation industry can build a metal tube, fill it with people, cargo, and fuel, and fly it all over the world, yet somehow they've taken all that complexity from design and construction to the pilot's hands on the controls and turned that into the safest way to get from point A to point B. This is the Wright Flyer at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, the very first powered flight. There's a temptation to assume that we can draw a straight line from the first flight to the modern jet aviation we enjoy today, security checks and airline food notwithstanding. But increasing complexity while also increasing reliability wasn't guaranteed. This is the Keystone Bomber. These were flown by the United States Army Air Corps after World War I. And they were used about 30 years after the first flight. And they don't look that different from the Wright Flyer, and they weren't built that differently. And so the Army wanted to build something new and modern to replace it. And so they held a design competition. The Army invited competitors to Dayton, Ohio for demonstration flights. And Boeing was expected to excel with this, the Model 299. This is a plane that begins to resemble the planes we see on tarmacs today. It was far more complex, but it could fly higher and faster and farther than any of its competitors. But on October 30th, 1935, the plane taxied onto the runway for another demonstration flight. The pilot pushed forward on the throttle. The plane smoothly accelerated down the runway, but at the moment where it should have gracefully lifted into the air, it struggled to gain altitude. The plane pitched up, stalled, pitched down, and crashed into the ground. The accident investigation revealed that this complex, sophisticated machine was brought down by a simple mistake. The pilot had forgotten to disengage a component of the aircraft that's designed to prevent wind damage while it's parked on the ground. This is a bit like leaving the parking brake on in your car when you try to back out of the driveway. This accident shook the Army's confidence, and it nearly threatened Boeing's existence. Reportedly, a local newspaper said that this plane was too complex for one man to fly. I think about that phrase a lot. What does it mean to build something that's too complex to work? Following the accident, Boeing could have looked at things one of two ways. They could have taken the person approach or the systems approach. The person approach says that we live in a just world where bad things only happen to bad people, that error is a moral failure. The systems approach says that we live in a world where failures are the sum of many acts. It recognizes that we live in a world where even the highest performing people will make mistakes. Not just because mistakes are inevitable, but because as our systems become more complex and more capable, the higher our expectations for those systems become. Though there wasn't a vocabulary for it in the 30s, this is what is now known as the Swiss cheese model of accident causation, a model where many defenses exist against failure, but unsafe acts and latent conditions can combine to create an accident, like a stack of Swiss cheese where the holes line up. Boeing could have blamed the pilot for the for the accident. They could have said he wasn't focused enough or that he overstated his capabilities. Instead, they sought to help the pilots manage the complexity of the aircraft. Instead, Boeing's solution was quite simple. It was the first aviation checklist, or rather, it was a set of printed cards with a checklist for each phase of flight, from starting the engines to preparing for landing. First adopted by one flight crew, it was adopted by other Model 299 crews, and then the whole of the aviation industry. Today, every commercial jet departure uses a checklist in some capacity. In the decades since their invention, checklists have been subjected to considerable research, and their use has spread to other specialties like medicine and finance. They've been shown to be an effective way to counter latent conditions and unsafe acts that lead to failures, like adding another layer of cheese to that stack of Swiss. Now, if you're like Joan went yesterday and you work with high voltage power lines and dangerous heights, then you know that the stakes are really high in documentation. But even if you're not dealing with potential fires or catastrophic injuries, your failures can lead to frustration, lost work, or lost time. So like other industries before us, we can adopt checklists to manage the complexity of the systems in which we work. So how do we use checklists to make documentation? Unfortunately, I don't have a checklist for you. We all work in different environments, we use different tools, we have different management practices, different teams, different skills. And so the complexity we face is itself complex. But I can show you the process of making a checklist that you could use in your environment. But first I need to make a distinction. A checklist is not a to-do list. Checklists are indivisible units of work, that it's something you can kind of sit down and do in one sitting, that they are completable, they're not aspirational, that you can reasonably expect to complete every item on a checklist, or nearly every item on the checklist. And they're repeatable, they're not improvisational, that you can reasonably expect to reuse your checklists in equivalent circumstances. Throughout this talk, I'm going to be talking about what's called the so-called normal checklist. In aviation, checklists come in two flavors, normal and non-normal. Normal checklists are for routine, expected operations, like, say, starting the engine or deploying your docks. Non-normal checklists are for things like troubleshooting, so why is this check engine light on? Where did this error message come from? Or for emergencies, like, why is this engine on fire? Or why is the website down? The principles of writing a checklist apply to both of these categories, but I'm going to be focusing on the routine things because it's a little bit easier to get started with those. So if you're going to make a checklist, it helps by finding a context or situation to use a checklist. It's difficult to work backwards and pick out things that you want to check up on and then attempt to shoehorn it into your process. It's a lot easier if you can find natural places to run through a checklist and then identify things that you can do in those places. So the three big places to look are physical thresholds, routine pauses, and process boundaries. Physical thresholds are the various physical transitions you make through the day. So sitting down at your desk, entering a conference room, leaving a building in the evening. Routine pauses are things like building your documentation or generating a report where you're sitting there for 30 seconds or a minute or 5 minutes for the computer to do its thing. Or when you go on hold for a conference call, or that thing at the beginning of every Skype call where the other person says, hold on, let me try restarting Skype, this will fix it. That's a good opportunity to go through a checklist and make sure you're prepared for that call. Process boundaries are a little more abstract. These are things like sign-offs, handoffs, version control commits, the beginnings and ends of meetings. Anywhere you start or end a task. You can recognize these process boundaries with the attention residue that it creates. So when you've ostensibly completed a task, but you're still thinking about that work, and you've got that little voice in the back of your head that says, did I get everything right? That's often a good place for a checklist. Or the sort of the reverse, where you're anticipating work that's coming up. So am I ready for this thing that I'm going to be responsible for later in the day or later in the week or year? To illustrate this process, I'm going to walk you through an approximation of the process I use to write my most used checklist, the merge checklist. I use, in my work, I use version control and private branches to kind of process my work. And so I'll get a request for a change, I'll work on that change privately, and then I'll merge that change back into a master repository. And I used to have to clean up after myself a lot. I would have to, I would merge those changes, and then I would immediately follow it up with this commit that says, fixing that last commit. Or even if I didn't have to clean up after a mistake, I would get anxious that I had made a mistake and would go back and check things again and again. And so this attention residue made it a good candidate for a checklist. But before we write down any steps, it helps to choose a pattern. So aviation checklists come in two big patterns, read, do, or do, confirm. Read, do is like a recipe. You read the item on the list, you do it, and then you move on to the next item on the list, and you read it, and you do it. Do, confirm is a little bit different. It's more of a gateway on work. You do your work, and then you run through the checklist to make sure, to verify that work that you've already done. And the order of the work itself doesn't matter, and the checklist is just making sure that it is in a state that it needs to be at that point in the process. You can also mix these two types, but it's sort of an advanced move, and it leads to kind of longer, more complicated checklists that are harder to use, and so I don't really recommend it. So here's the merge checklist, both as a read, do, and do, confirm checklist side by side. So here under read, do, I have 4 steps. So I run tests to make sure the running code in my project works as I expect. I run spell check to make sure there's no real embarrassing mistakes there. And then I schedule a review. So I am the only writer on my team, so I don't get the benefit of a back and forth with an editor. And so I will schedule a review 2 weeks in the future to come back with that with fresh eyes. And then lastly, I run that merge command. And this is an okay start. I can do the redo version over and over again, and I'll know when I've succeeded because I got to step 4 and I did it. But if I'm being honest with myself, the order here doesn't really matter that much. So the do confirm checklist is the same thing, but with the merge command removed. So this becomes a pre-merge checklist. I've slightly shifted the context here. After trying both formats, I like the do confirm version better. I get a little more flexibility. If I schedule a review first and then run spell check, it doesn't really make a difference, and I get kind of freedom to vary my day a little bit. But your preferences might vary, and the needs of your process might vary. Some things are going to have strict ordering that you're going to need to adhere to. But before we go on, let's take a closer look at picking the steps that go on your checklist. If you have a context, how do you choose what to check in that context? And there's two schools of thought here. One is standard operating procedure, and the other is essential tasks, also known as killer items. Standard operating procedure says we're going to list everything we're supposed to do and get it right every time. No matter how important any individual step is, the whole needs to be represented there. The essential tasks approach says we're only going to look at those things required to ensure safe operation. In aviation, the dichotomy is sort of illustrated with the seatbelt. So standard operating procedure says you're going to have checklists that tell the pilot to put on a seatbelt. The killer items approach says, well, no plane ever crashed because the pilot wasn't wearing a seatbelt, so we're not going to include it. So here's my merge checklist, both as standard procedure and essential tasks only. The standard procedure version adds 2 steps. It makes sure the build is completed successfully, and that I've added index entries for searching and finding. These weren't on the list before, 1, because I forgot the first one, and 2, because I never ever screw up the second one. I always get that one right. But they're both standard operating procedure, so now they're both on the list. The essential killer items approach drops both of these new things, because what's the worst that could happen? If the build doesn't work, I don't need to really worry about that too much because the deployment subsequently won't work either, so it's not really a concern. And index entries, it's really something only I notice. Plus I get to remove 2 steps. A shorter checklist is faster, and that's pretty nice. And so I'm going to stick with the essentials version going forward. But you might prefer the longer one, and this, again, this is more about preferences and about the needs of your process more than it is about the format of the list. So once you've got your checklist, you have to get in the habit of using it. And this is the hardest part. There are 2 components to using your checklist reliably, and that's remembering to start the checklist and actually finishing the checklist. So first you have to start the checklist. This is easiest if you can attach your checklist to existing habits. So I have an end of the workday checklist that I go through. And as it happens, I also have a standing meeting at the end of each day. And so it's very easy for me to roll from the end of that meeting right into that checklist so that I have that sort of awareness of my work at the end of the day. But sometimes you don't always get the benefit of a habit that you can hook into. And so another way to build that habit is to reward yourself. So when you complete that checklist, you can have a piece of candy or something. And it's kind of it's acting on that lizard part of your brain, but it can be pretty effective. Another option is to log your results. So knowing that your checklist is catching meaningful errors can be very motivating. And you can also use that data for some things I'm going to talk about a little bit later. Now, once you start the checklist, you actually have to check everything off on the list. And this means looking at each item and actually doing it, not just pretending to do it. And it means not getting distracted, getting 2/3 of the way through your list, and then moving on to some other more interesting task. And here, there's a couple different ways you can improve this situation. One is the physicality of the list itself can help. If you can print it off or write it down, it can be it's a lot easier to focus on the list when it's kind of outside the context of your computer screen. So I keep a bunch of checklists printed on cards and right next to my computer, and I have a bunch of checklists for this talk, just to make sure that we're all ready to go. And the physicality of checking each item can also be very useful. Pilots are trained to do this thing called point and shoot, where they will point at the item on the list and then point at the thing that they're verifying. And that motion, that you build that muscle memory of checking each item. You can also say each item out loud. I work from home, so if the cat minds me reading my checklist out loud, she hasn't said anything yet. When you're done, you can add some kind of completion ritual. You can announce that you've completed your checklist, if you work with just cats. Or you can turn the checklist over or put it in a slot where it belongs, something that just kind of marks the conclusion. It's a signal to yourself that you've done it. Now, once you're in the habit of using a checklist, it's good to periodically review your checklist when you're not using them. It's hard to think critically about the items in your list when you're in the moment and doing the work. That really, a checklist should be helping you move faster and better through your process. And you can't stop to think about, well, is this the right thing to be doing every time? So when you do review a checklist, this is an opportunity for you to adapt to the changes in your work. Change is inevitable. If your checklists are not changing from time to time, then you're probably not using them. And so this review process is an opportunity to adapt these changing procedures in your workflow, into your checklists. When airlines aircraft manufacturers produce these recommended checklists for airlines, and they send them out to the airlines every time they discover some new issue with the aircraft. And the airlines almost universally do not use these checklists. They adapt them for their own use. They adapt them for the airline's own processes and for the pilot's preferences. When airlines merge, one of the biggest fights is whose checklists are going to win out. Reviewing your checklist is also a good opportunity to troubleshoot problems. Some common problems with checklists are skipping them outright, or not completing them, or not catching interesting problems. So if you're skipping a checklist often, it may be that the context you've imagined that this checklist fits into isn't really suited to that list, so that you don't actually have enough time, or your attention is going to be somewhere else at that point in the process. And so maybe a checklist just doesn't make sense there, or at least not at that moment. If you're starting a checklist but you're not finishing it, often this means that the checklist is too long or complicated to work through. And so that's an opportunity to either remove extraneous items or split it into separate lists that you'll get a little more granularity of the lists themselves. The research on checklists says 5 to 9 items, barring other compelling kind of operational reasons, is the optimal length for a checklist. It's long enough to feel substantial, but not so long that you can't really keep it in your head. If a checklist feels like it's becoming pointless busy work, make sure that you're checking things that matter. Sometimes you'll find that your workflow has evolved in ways that the checklist hasn't kept up with. But other times you'll find that the process that you have has gotten better and better, and this checklist is no longer needed. And every now and then you're going to discard a checklist, and that's also an important part of using a checklist. It totally happens. And yeah. So let's review this pre-merge checklist after a few weeks of using it. Here I've added the date, so I know when I last reviewed it, and I've added 2 steps. The second step is that index entry is created, because it turns out I didn't actually do this every single time. I missed it a lot. So even though it's not a big problem, it represented a recurring error, and I wanted to catch it. The first item is looked at build output. Some aviation checklists have these headers or a first step that say fly the plane, because there are several examples of pilots getting so fixated on solving some relatively minor technical issue, working through a checklist, that they lose situational awareness. They forget what they are, where they are and what they're doing, and their responsibility for flying the plane. And so as they're working through these checklists, they run out of fuel and crash into the ground. And accident investigators call this controlled flight into terrain, and where you have an otherwise airworthy aircraft and it crashes for reasons that are basically about the pilot's attention. And so I was, in my work, I was missing glaring formatting mistakes because I was worried about all these sort of technical checks, but I wasn't actually looking at the thing that I was generating. And so I've added this step, looked at build output, because this is my controlled flight into terrain. And it's a little embarrassing to admit that about myself, that my attention has these like weird limits and habits to them. But I've reviewed it and I've added it to the list, and things are better now, and I've got a better checklist. So what now? If checklists served no other purpose than what I've shown, I'd still be up here, but checklists enable some other more sophisticated work. So first is automation. Checklists can be used with automation in three really big ways. First, you can use checklists to check up on your automation. Automated stuff breaks all the time. I'm sure you've heard a horror story where a team trusted a backup system was working and relied on it for a really long time, and then that day finally came when they needed the backup, and they went and looked, and there was nothing there. So checklists can be really a useful tool for making sure that your automated systems are doing what they ought to be doing. Second, you can integrate checklists into your automation. So this pre-merge checklist, for instance, I use it with, I use the Git version control tool, and it has this nice feature called hooks, where you can run your own code at various points in the version control process. And so I can have Git prompt me to run through my merge checklist at the time that I actually run the merge command. Or even better, I can have Git show me the checklist text itself. So this is one of my few checklists I don't actually have printed out on paper, because I can have the computer show it to me on screen. Third, you can use checklists to prototype automation. So when I see something that can be automated, I'm very tempted to start writing code. And this is not always the best idea. It's really easy to invest a lot more time and attention into automating a system than it necessarily deserves, particularly if it's infrequent or difficult to automate. And so instead, you can use checklists to validate automation, to be a prototype for that work. So instead, you can write a checklist. You can log your use with that checklist, so you can run through it and record data about how often you've used it, what errors you caught, what successes you had, and then use that information to determine whether it justifies the development time and resources to build a real automated solution. Another way to use your checklists is to use them with other people. Depending on your team, this may be something that will work for you, maybe not. If you can, you get the benefit of call and response. So one person reads the checklist, the other person completes each item or verifies each item. Personally, I'm the only writer on my team. I have very few opportunities to use a checklist with another person. So I don't have a lot to say in this area. Atul Gawande's book, The Checklist Manifesto, is a great resource I can recommend, though. He's got a lot in there about using checklists, not just in a team setting, but also using the checklist as a tool to improve team cohesiveness itself. Gawande is a surgeon, and he helped make a checklist that has saved many lives around the world, and it's a really wonderful book, but if you have any surgery planned, you should maybe wait. Finally, you can use your checklist to put your time and attention to where it needs to be. Sometimes it may feel like using a checklist is going to deprive you of opportunities to be spontaneous or creative. But I guarantee that your workflow has tasks in which nobody benefits from spontaneity or creativity. No customer wants to know how imaginatively your sample code crashes. No editor wants to know how creative your spelling is. And no teammate wants to see how spontaneous your deployments are. But instead, you can use a checklist to make sure that you're devoting your time and attention to the hard problems in your work. Thank you.